Thank you, Fred, for energizing us all before this last talk. You'll just notice that it actually says University of Winnipeg there now. That's because I got a new job about 2 months ago. Found out that I was going to be moving to Winnipeg from South Dakota, so I'm happy to come back to Canada after leaving it for a few years. So this afternoon I want to talk a little bit about Sufism or Islamic mysticism. Thank you. I was thinking, after listening to all these fantastic talks today, there's a sort of appropriateness with ending with Islam. In part because Islam is really the last of, we might say, the major world religions to come onto the scene. And in a way, Muslims have long thought of their tradition as a re-articulation, a synthesis of the essence of what has come before. So the Quran describes people like Jesus and Moses and Noah, and it hints at other holy figures and prophets that aren't described. And it describes them all as being Muslims. Those who are in a state of harmony with ultimate reality is one way to put that. So there's this sense that there is ultimately one message that has been articulated in different ways at different times, and that Islam, again, is a re-articulation of this very same message. Now, there's something appropriate about this as well, because I noticed as I was listening to these talks that, unfortunately, I'm sorry, but I'm going to be saying much of the same thing that you've been hearing all day today, just maybe throwing in some old Arabic words as well. But it really struck me, actually, the similarities between what Shiv began with and what George said, Reverend Zenji, Susan. Everybody really is touching on so many of the same themes. And so again, it shouldn't necessarily surprise us if, coming from more of an Islamic perspective, we're seeing these themes being re-articulated, right? So just to sort of set it up. Now, one other thing before we get into the subject, I thought, okay, here's another story I should tell. And this comes from Rumi. And George had also mentioned Rumi, who's really one of the most famous, probably the most famous of the Islamic mystical poets. And he's got this great story. It's about 4 individuals who show up at a market. One of them comes from, well, you know, you can really pick any country or whatever, but in Rumi's time, he talked about Turks and Persians and Arabs. So you got a Turk, you got a Persian, you got an Arab, and they show up at the market, and they don't have a lot of money, but they say, hey, why don't we pool our resources together, and we'll get more stuff. So let's put it all together and get more stuff. So they pool the resources, and pretty soon, though, a little bit of a fight breaks out. So one of them says, we've come here for, he says a Turkish word. And the Persian says, that's not what we've come here for. We have come here for, we need to pool our resources for a Persian word. And of course, the Arab says, you're both crazy. You know, if you really know what's going on, we've come here for, and he says an Arabic word. Now, what happens is there's an individual who's standing just beside them who knows all 3 languages. So he goes up to them, and he says, gentlemen, look, I can solve your problem. You're gonna need to trust me. Give me all your money. That's never really a good deal to enter into, but okay, fine. So they give him the money, and he says, I promise you'll all be satisfied. So they roll the dice, they give him the money, he goes to the market, and he comes back with a bunch of grapes. And the Turk goes, that's what I was talking about. Yes, and the Persian goes, that's what I was talking about. Yes. And the Arab says, that's what I was trying to tell you guys. That's what we're here for. Right? So when you actually get the grapes, and you're eating the grapes, it doesn't really matter so much what you call them. Right? And you stop fighting over the names when you get the named. Right? And I think that's something that really we're articulating in various ways today. When you get the goods, when you're eating the grapes, when you're experiencing love, or you're encountering truth, or you're feeling peace, doesn't matter what you call it. You don't care. You stop worrying about it. Call it Buddha. Call it Allah. Call it Christ. You're just not worried about it anymore when you find it, when you eat the grapes, right? So just a little story to start us off. Now, let's get into this subject of Sufism here. And we'll see how much I can cover in the time that I have. All right, so here's the three broad things I want to do. If we don't get through them all, that's fine. But let's at least try to work through some of these. Okay, so I'll try to start off by discussing a Sufi understanding of reality that acknowledges both unity and diversity. The unity of diversity and the diversity of unity, we might say. Again, something that we've been talking about. The second thing, if I have time, I want to touch on is this idea of Baraka. This is also an important concept for harmony. So I would say the first one is like a worldview that I think contributes to harmony. And the second is, well, an energy that contributes to harmony. And then finally, if we have time, we can talk a little bit about how this particular worldview lends itself, I think, to a healthy way of understanding the different religions in the world. Perhaps a more healthy way than we seem to see so much of in the world today. Okay, so Sufi vision of unity and diversity. There's a lot of text. I have a bad habit of putting way too much text on slides. As a professor, I should probably know not to do this, but it's a lesson that I'm still in the process of learning. So please forgive me. Don't worry too much about all that stuff. I'll speak to some of it. If you're interested, you can take notes, and I can definitely send these slides to Shit as well if you want them for reference. Okay, first thing, well, maybe this picture I'll point to. This is it's actually a Turkish art form. Quite a beautiful Turkish art form, I quite like it, but it's Arabic calligraphy, and it says Allah Muhabba, which means God is love, or God is the beloved, or God is the lover. And it's important, I think, for us to think of Islam and love, because we don't often think of those two things together. But really, I think if you understand the Islamic tradition well, you know that this is at the heart of this religion. Just don't always see it. Now, Sufism itself is an aspect of Islam. It developed within Islamic civilization. We might say it's the mysticism or the spirituality of Islam. I think that's pretty fair. And it comes from an Arabic word, tasawwuf, which is a word that means a process. The process of becoming a Sufi, which isn't terribly helpful until you know what a Sufi is. Well, there's many definitions. I've got one here at the bottom. This is a nice definition of Sufism, coming to us from the 11th century. Sufism is this: whatever you have in your mind, forget it. Whatever you have in your hand, give it. Whatever is to be your fate, face it. So Sufis love doing this, kind of encapsulating a lot in just a few short words. It's one of the nice talents of the Sufi poets, I think, is to do this. And one of the reasons why their poetry is so beloved around the world. Another definition that's very common is a Sufi is one who is completely absorbed, has completely disappeared in the beloved. Has really completely gone off the grid in God. Now, this is based on the Quran. Sufis use Quranic terminology, and they read the Quran, but in a bit of a unique way. They see layers of meaning in the text that they consider like an ocean that you dive into, as opposed to just a set of words that you read and understand in a very basic way. One Sufi teacher, I tried to meet him when I was in Syria, but he was in retreat, spiritual retreat, very interesting individual. He said, the way the Sufis understand the Quran, he said, think of a word in the Quran, and then think of like a name of your friend. Let's say you have a friend named Ahmed, or Daniel, or Melissa. There's the name, but then there's the reality that that name points to. And think of the difference between the two. Think of the world of meaning that is the reality behind that name. And Sufis say that's how we read a holy text. You know, we see the word, but then we think of the whole reality, the living reality that that word is pointing to. So it's based on the Quran. It's also believed to be a transmission, a mystical transmission from Muhammad, that he didn't share with all of his followers. There are many, many sayings of Muhammad's followers that said, I got two things from the messenger of God. One I've told you, the other I probably shouldn't, because you might think I'm crazy or a heretic or something like that. So I'm going to have to keep quiet about it. And there are numerous sayings like this. Numerous sayings that suggest this. Look, I got two things from Muhammad, and some of it I'm sharing with you, and some of it I simply can't. However, Ali is usually seen as somebody who absorbed this mystical transmission most fully. There are a few other individuals, but Ali tends to be the most common, and of course he's important for Sufis and for Shia Muslims as well, as being somebody who embodies these spiritual qualities from Muhammad. By the medieval period, Sufism sort of goes mainstream, we might say. It started off as the very sort of, we might say, secretive teaching, small circles of masters and disciples. Men and women, it's important to point out as well. There were many important female Sufi leaders who actually Atif Khalil, a very fine scholar of Islam, will be speaking about tomorrow. So in a way, this is Sufism 101, and then you can get the more advanced course tomorrow. So I think it'll work pretty well. Just another story, and I don't want to steal Atif's fire, but I have to tell this one little story before I move on. He'll probably talk about Rabia, one of the most important early female Sufi teachers. But one great anecdote of hers I love. She's running through town with a torch and a pail of water. And somebody says, Rabia, what are you doing now with this torch and this pail of water? She says, well, I'm going to go torch paradise, burn it down. I'm going to go pour this water in hell and put the fires of hell out, so that nobody worships God out of desire for reward or fear of punishment. They'll just worship God for his own sake, for love. So lots of great anecdotes about Rabia, so hopefully you can hear more, we'll hear more of those tomorrow. So by the medieval period, Sufism goes mainstream. It actually becomes one of the most important institutions in Islamic societies. This is something we often forget. Sufism has been critically important to Islamic history. A very good scholar of Islam said, there was a time when the Sufi shrine was more representative of Islam than the minaret of the mosque. It sounds crazy to some modern ears, but in fact, historically, we know this was the case. Sufis were the mainstream representatives of the Islamic tradition. They've developed a huge variety of techniques of transcendence, we might say. Methods to dive below the surface of the self, to explore the inner cosmos. We know a number of spiritual traditions, including Sufism, talk about the infinity of the external cosmos and the infinity of the internal cosmos. And that these techniques have been developed to explore that. It's premised on this idea of a direct knowledge of spiritual reality, what is sometimes called gnosis in the Western tradition, a sort of intuitive, experiential knowing. In Arabic, it's kashf, which means to unveil, or ma'arifa, which literally means knowing, so a sort of direct knowledge. Now, one thing I want to say, Sufism has developed within Islamic civilization. Vast majority of Sufis are very devout Muslims, but the spirit goes where it wills, and Sufi lineages have been passed to Hindu families, to Christians, Jews, people of a variety of backgrounds. Actually, one of the Sufi masters that I've had the good fortune of spending some time with and interviewing and meditating with is a British guy who gained his Sufi lineage from a Russian woman, who gained it from a Hindu master, who gained it from his uncle, who got it from a Muslim Sufi sheikh a couple hundred years ago in India. So we see Sufism being transmitted from a Muslim to a Hindu, to a Russian woman, to a British man who now has a center in Northern California. And he was recently on Oprah, which was kind of fun. I got to ask him how Oprah was, and he actually said she was really genuine. He had this very, just a little anecdote. He said, you know, my training is to hear your question, but to hear your real question, not the question that you're asking. So he said, I listen for the real question, not the one that you come out with. And he said, and especially with famous people, there's usually such a facade. So you expect almost like two people. But he said Oprah was just herself. She's a very genuine person. So he seemed to have a good experience with me. But just as an illustration for how Sufism, though primarily existing within Islam, can also be transmitted outside of the bounds of the Islamic religion. Now, moving to the next point, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of, in Arabic, wahdat al-wujud, which means the oneness of being, the oneness of existence. And this is where we get to this whole Sufi vision of unity and diversity. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about that. Now, I think there's something very interesting actually about Islamic art. I mean, when you first look at it, it just looks like really cool, fancy tiles. That's one of the things that Islamic art is known for, these very intricate, mathematically complex, beautiful tile work that you see in mosques and in homes in various parts of the Muslim world. Now, in a way, though, it visually expresses one of the key insights of Islamic and Sufi philosophy. It really expresses a lot of what we've been talking about today. What you're seeing in that tile is the simultaneous existence of oneness and diversity. Right? There are many colors, there are many shapes, but they are all harmoniously integrated into a larger pattern of oneness, of unity. This actually expresses the central doctrine of Islam, Tawheed, which is an Arabic word, which you could translate actually as harmonization. Harmonization would actually be a pretty solid translation of Tawheed. It literally means, if you look in an Arabic dictionary, to make one, to unify, to join, to merge, to consolidate, to reconcile, to harmonize. Now for Sufis, Tawheed does not simply describe God. For most Muslims, Tawheed means monotheism. To make God one, to believe that God is one. But Sufis say, here's the thing. God is, well in Arabic, wujud, is a word that means being or existence. God is existence as such, full stop. God is being. If that's the case, say Sufis, any person, any object, anything that exists, in its essence is existence, or being. If you are being. But you're not being as such, you're not absolute being, sheer being. You're being modified in a particular way, expressed, limited in a particular form. So you are God, but you are also not God. To the degree that you exist, you are God. To the degree that you are you, well, Sufis would say, something like a dream, but don't take it too hard. Here's a great summary of this by one of my favorite Sufi teachers, Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi, somebody whose shrine I was able to go hang out in Damascus, Syria. He says, "Know that which is termed God is one in essence, through the essence, but it is everything through the forms and the names." Very, very simply put, know that what we call God is one in essence, but it is everything in terms of name and form. Now, some of you who are from a Hindu background might be going, why are you talking about Vedanta right now? Or if we think of what Reverend Zenji shared with us about the highest Buddha, with all of the arms, taking all these different forms out of compassion for people. Well, this is starting to sound kind of the same. Or what George was talking about earlier today. Right, so again, this is one way to think of the Islamic tradition and Islamic mysticism as a re-articulation of truths that people have been saying for a very, very long time. All right.
Daniel.
Did I do that? Did I do that? Or
It was the spirit.
It was the spirit.
George is too close to he's giving off electricity.
All right, he's shorting out the system, so. Not so much of a worry. The last thing that I'll say is, what are the implications of this in terms of religion and religious diversity? And I think one of the really important points that we find the Sufis expressing is that if this is the case, that God is being as such, and there is ultimately one being that is being expressed in different forms, then the religions too are simply different expressions of one truth, and the true knower, the true Gnostic, Sufis say, worships God in every single form. The real disbeliever, they say, is one who says God only in my form, but they can't worship God in another form. They reject, they disbelieve in God in your form, or your form, or your form. They said the true knower of God sees God in every form, and recognizes God in every form. And the other thing that they say is that the self-revelations of God, the expressions of God, never repeat themselves once. Existence is always new. Okay, I think I've said enough. We've had a great day, and so we'll leave it there. And if we have any questions, we can continue.
Let me just get this. I'll give you the actual thing so you can see through. I think perhaps that thing's over here. Hopefully it's not the ball. We've got problems with
Rory, can you separate, let's just say you can separate Jesus from Catholicism. Indeed you can.
Yeah.
Can you separate Sufism from Islam?
Yeah. Okay, so this is a very interesting question. Can you separate Sufism from Islam? Now, the scholar in me wants to say, well, it depends which Sufi you ask. I, for my research, interviewed a number of Sufi teachers here in North America from various lineages, various backgrounds, and I did, in fact, get very different answers to this question. There is a sense in which Sufism is just the inward expression, the inward spirituality of Islam. Many Sufis say, look, Islam has a law, like Judaism, it has a sacred law, Sharia, it's called in Arabic, but if you're following the law, if you're obeying the commands of God, or you're following the worship program that the Sharia outlines, but you're doing it like a robot, what's the point? What would be the point of even doing that? So the Sufis said, there is a point to doing this. And the point is actually your inward state. That these practices, if you know what they are, they're keys to unlock deeper knowledge. But if you don't, you're just standing and bowing and doing all sorts of things.
You're live again.
Okay. It's fun, yeah. So yeah, I think some would say, look, Sufism is just the inward aspect of Islam. It's understanding Islam. It's understanding what these rituals mean. Now, the other answer that Sufis would give is that Sufism is like any, what we might say, mystical tradition. It's a path of transformation. It's a path of discovering the truth. And what your religious background is completely irrelevant to that.
So you can't separate them.
You can. You can. Now again, you would have some Sufi teachers, and it might be interesting to ask Dr. Atif Khalil tomorrow what he says about this, because he might reflect a perspective that says, no, you can't separate these two. And certainly, I know there are many Sufis who believe that, but historically speaking, you see different forms of Sufism, some of which fall outside of the bounds of Islam. Yeah.
So can you say that
Can you say that Islam is the exoteric side and Sufism is the esoteric? Can you say that?
Yeah, I think absolutely you can. And that's certainly one way that Sufism is understood, is being the esoteric or the inward aspect, the inward esoteric teachings of Islam, and what we might call Islamic law and theology being the outward, the exoteric. But again, it really depends on which lineage you're talking about. And lineages go in different directions. That's the other thing. They change over time. So,
Rory, is there a similarity with Christianity and basically what Christianity went through? For example, the Nicene Conference, where they separated kind of the Roman Orthodox, Coptics, and Gnostics were kicked out, similar to the Sufis, I would think.
yeah, so this question is interesting. Like, if you think of Christianity, at some point the Gnostics, the mystics, started to have a bit of a hard time. And there is an inherent tension between, we might say, the position of a cleric and the position of a mystic. Not to say that they can't overlap, and we do see this. People like Al-Ghazali, one of the most famous Muslim scholars, was also a mystic and tried to reconcile these two. Thomas Aquinas was arguably something of a mystic himself, and so you can kind of see some joining of this. But there is a tension as well. And one of the tensions is, for somebody who says the Bible or the Quran says, this is what God wants, and then somebody shows up and says, well, I've actually been talking with God, and I think you've got it wrong. That's potentially destabilizing to the tradition. So there's a sense of danger. You're going, well, you're reading what God has told you in a book, but I've just been hanging out with him. And I've got 2.0 here. I've got the updated version, and people start going, well, this is potentially dangerous. You're potentially threatening our authority, because our authority is based off of being able to interpret these texts for people. And if you say, well, I don't necessarily need that, I can go to the source. And Sufis said this. They would chide the scholars. They would say, you take your knowledge, the dead from the dead. You know, dead authors from dead authors. We take our knowledge from the living one who never dies.
So Sufism is still evolving. Yes.
Oh, yeah, Sufism is still evolving. And it's interesting. I mean, as I said, Sufism has really existed on the margins of the Islamic tradition, in the center of the Islamic tradition. It's been pushed to the margins again recently. There have been a number of Islamic movements, like ISIS. Actually, ISIS fighters have blown up some of the most important Sufi shrines in Iraq and Syria. Because for them, Sufism is a huge threat, quite clearly, to what they do. So we see this actually all over the world. There's a real unfortunate purging of Sufism from many Muslim contexts, for some of the reasons that we've, I think, been discussing.
So of the population of Muslims around the world, how much are Sufis?
Yeah, well, this is a good question. So how many Sufis would you find amongst Muslims? Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. As I said before, in some cases, Sufism is so integrated with the Islamic practice of a people, they wouldn't get the question. If you said, so what of this is Islam and what of this is Sufism? They'd say, well, I was at the mosque praying my midday prayer, and then I went over to the Sufi shrine, and I gave a prayer there because there's a lot of blessing energy there. And this is a friend of God who's been buried here. And so, you know, there's a sense of getting blessing and power from being in that person's presence, even after they die. And so, but you might say, oh, well, wait, that's a Sufi. And say, well, I don't know, he's just a devout Muslim. And maybe they would have a pilgrimage to another shrine. And you'd say, oh, you're doing something Sufi. And they'd say, well, this is just what we know of as Islam. So in places like Morocco, for instance, that's the case. It used to be in Bosnia, many parts of Pakistan, India, people's Islam is Sufism, as we might say. But in other cases, there's much more of a conscious sense of being a part of a Sufi order, having a Sufi master, which, like many traditions, is critical in Sufism. Rumi, another Rumi quote, he said, if you don't have a sheikh, which is like the Arabic word for guru, he said, a 2-day journey is going to take you 200 years. Because if you think of the inward cosmos as being relatively like flying out into space, it's pretty big, it's pretty vast. And if you have somebody who knows how to fly a spacecraft, i.e. consciousness, to develop and transform, then they can expedite the process considerably. So, hanging out with a Sufi master has been important. And in that case, they might think of themselves as a Sufi. But to answer your question, I think there was a time when the vast majority of Muslims would have been connected with Sufism in some shape or form. That has changed in the past 200 years for a variety of reasons, historical, theological. There have been a number of developments that have led to an anti-Sufism. One of them is actually modernity. There's a sense in which many Muslims felt like the Sufis were not so rational. They were ecstatic. They liked using, it's actually kind of funny, I think this is again kind of chiding some of the orthodox jurists, they love talking about God as the best wine in the universe. So they say, look, okay, be a drunkard, get wasted, but only off the finest stuff in the universe, and that's God. So that's the wine we get drunk on. So they use this language, but they were ecstatic. They're not necessarily rational, although some Sufis are philosophers. And so many Muslims felt like too much navel-gazing, too much drunken-style poetry, and look, the Europeans have come and walked all over us. We need to get away from this stuff. We need to get back in the world, activist, rational, modernize. And to do that, we've got to get rid of Sufism. It's standing in the way of us getting a strong stance in the world again. So there's been a purging, I think, in the past few hundred years of Sufism from many Muslim contexts.
And yet, like with the conquest of Europe, like the wars in Spain and so on, the Sufis really...
Well, and this is again an important point to point out. Sufis have, in some cases, been very much against what we might call imperial Islam, so the Islam of the sultans and the dynasties, but they've also been with it. As a scholar, you have to take a look at the three dimensions of the thing: the good, the bad, and the ugly. And any human phenomenon has this, and I think it's important that we acknowledge it. I'd love to tell you that Sufis were just really great, nice, poetic, dancing, ecstatic people. Some of them really were. Many of them are. But Sufis have also been soldiers and generals and advisors to sultans who would have shared the general sense of, yes, the imperial project. Let's expand Islamic rule, this sort of thing. But you always saw a spectrum. I mean, if you look back at, let's say, the Seljuks, which were a Turkish dynasty, central Muslim lands, you had Al-Ghazali, this great Sufi scholar, who was their buddy. He wrote books explaining why Muslims should listen to the Seljuks, that they were upholding true Islam, and of course the Seljuks gave him great positions in universities, slow clap, keep up the good work, saying all this nice stuff about us. But then of course you had Sufis who said the Seljuks have been taking land. They just come in and they take people's land, and that's against Islamic law. You can't just take land, and if any scholar works at a university from stolen land and lives off the proceeds, how can you call yourself pious? So think of some bad words to say about the Seljuks. Those Sufis generally didn't get the nice positions. They tended to disappear at some point. But it's important to highlight that Sufis have had a range of approaches to power and politics. And we want to appreciate all of those. I don't think we want to just say, well, it was just this or it was just that.
Ismailis, are they Sufi?
Yeah, so Ismailis, Shia Muslims.
With the Aga Khan, right?
Yeah, so if you think of the Aga Khan being the present leader of Ismailis, this is one way to think about it. As I said before, so Muhammad apparently taught an inward teaching. We might say secret teachings, esoteric teachings, mystical teachings to his closest followers, and in particular to Ali. So Ali is a really important figure. Actually, the first slide, maybe I'll go back to that. I'll just kind of point something out on this calligraphy here that I have on the title slide. Yeah, perfect, thank you. So actually, in Arabic, we've got the name of God in the middle, Allah. And then we've got, on the outside, Muhammad. And we also have Ali. So we see Ali, Muhammad's name, with God's name in the middle, the three of them being named here. And there, as I said before, there's a real reason for that. There's a saying of Muhammad's that's generally accepted as being authentic by both Sunnis and Shias that says, I'm the city of knowledge, and Ali is its gate. Ali is the gateway to, we might say, the mystical knowledge, the esoteric knowledge. And most Sufi orders trace their lineage to Ali. Now, the Ismailis, the Aga Khan, would trace his lineage to Ali. And one way to think about Shia Islam is being one crystallization of this inward teaching, and Sufism being another crystallization of this inward or esoteric or mystical teaching. Both of them share a huge number of concepts, and historically it's tough to know who did what first. And of course everybody wants to claim, so the Sufis would say, look, we were saying that way before you Shia Muslims, and the Shias said, look, we did this first and then you guys took it from us. I think historically there's really no way to know. I would say they both evolved out of this transmission. And they crystallized in slightly different ways. And so certainly that would be one way to understand Ismaili and Shia Islam, as being like a cousin of Sufism, just taking a slightly different form.
Where do you place Baha'i faith?
Yeah, Baha'i faith is interesting. Now, it's not something that I'm as knowledgeable in. I haven't studied it as much as some other things, so I would love to give you a really in-depth answer, but I'm not sure that I can. As I understand it, Baha'ism is also arising out of an esoteric strand of Islam in Iran, so it would be a form of esoteric Shi'ism, Shia Islam.
The great Baha'u'llah and the great Bab.
Right, so the Bab and Baha'u'llah, again, I think you could see that as another branch. That's how I would understand it anyways, as another branch off of Shia Islam that starts to take its own direction, but still probably transmitting some of the same ideas and beliefs that you'd find in other forms.
Persia.
Yes, yeah.
It's different. It is different.
Well, and yeah, sorry, yeah.
Where is Ishnashri is part of the same thing, Ishnashri community. So Ishnashri, it's like...
Oh, Ithna Ashari. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, right. So Ithna Ashari, that's just a word that means 12er in Arabic. Right, so the 12ers are actually the main Shia sect. So if you go to Iran and Iraq, the majority of people in Iran, the majority of people in Iraq are 12ers, Ithna Ashari, which the difference between them and the Ismailis is basically, to try to make it as short as I can here, so Muhammad has this, let's say, energy, power, blessing, and transmission of teachings. Sufis believe that it goes through the heads of their Sufi orders, their spiritual masters. Shia Muslims believe it gets transmitted through his family line of descent. So and Ali married Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. And so they believe that their two sons, Hassan and Hussein, who were the Prophet Muhammad's grandsons, inherited not only his bloodline, but his spiritual insight and power. So for Shia Muslims, that's passed down through descent. Now, at some point, this is humanity, people differed over who should be the one who inherits this authority. So the Ismailis said, this is the one who's really the inheritor of Muhammad's charisma and spiritual power and authority, and the Ithna Asharis said, no, it is this individual, and they went two different directions, and eventually the Ithna Asharis said there were only 12 people who inherited this after Muhammad, and then the last one has gone into what they call a spiritual hiding, and he'll come back before the end of time. Whereas the Ismailis say, no, there's a living representative of this with us at all times. So,
Excuse me. And the question now comes here,
sure.
that if Sufism or Sufis and Shias are cousins, as you said,
Yes.
and so is the Wahhabis, and their lineage is from Ali.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting.
Where comes the ISIS? Where they come from?
Yeah.
Where ISIS come from?
We're kind of in the hot seat up here, I gotta say. This is, but no, these are great questions. It's a very good question. Yeah, I'll do my best to answer. So this is a question about Wahhabism. Okay, ISIS. One way to think about ISIS. I mean, you have to be careful with words. You do have to be careful, but Wahhabism or Salafism is another word, might be one way to describe their theology. And it's a profoundly anti-Sufi, anti-Shia theology. And so there's a sense of destroying shrines, in some cases killing Sufis. There have been suicide bombings at Sufi shrines in Pakistan, in parts of Africa, Iraq, Syria, etc., etc.
Would they be closer to Sunni?
Well, it's an offshoot of Sunnism. It's an offshoot of Sunnism, yeah. So Wahhabism, Salafism is an offshoot of Sunni Islam, but it's like a part of Islam that, here's my take on it. I'll kind of give you my own thoughts on this. This might even be my own theology. So as a religious studies professor, I'm like, I'm sinning right now. So I hope, yeah, because it's being filmed, as long as it's maybe cut this part up. Okay. I think what Wahhabism, what Salafism is a rejection of their own roots. It's a rejection, it's like they don't, I would even call it a rejection of the feminine, a rejection of the spiritual, a rejection, there's so many things you could call it, but it's almost an allergic reaction to anything mystical or spiritual in Islam. And it then leads to a desire to purge the tradition of all of these things. Because it seems to be, again, I'm just giving you my own sort of riffing on this here, it seems to be a mania for order. I want just there to be a book, with clear rules that you follow the program, that's how you worship God, that's how you get to heaven, end of story. And the Sufis go, yeah, interesting, okay. But how do you actually do that? How do you actually know God? You know, how do you actually connect with it? What's the reality? What does the word God mean? Right? And you know, there's I think this sort of sense of not wanting to go there, just wanting to keep it very simple. Almost like in IKEA manuals are not simple. Actually, this isn't a good analogy. Maybe IKEA manuals are more like Sufi texts. You know, and getting in and out of IKEA is pretty complex as well. But okay, let's say some kind of manual, some kind of technical manual, one written better than an IKEA manual, is I think what Salafism and Wahhabism is looking for in Islam. They want just a nice, clear, exoteric, external rules, that sort of thing. And so there's a real distrust and dislike of the mystical and the esoteric, and so I think that's why they target it. But again, please don't maybe quote me on that. I'm just kind of sharing some of my own, you know, thoughts on this. Yeah.
So maybe 2 or 3 days ago, a tragedy happened in Saudi Arabia during while Muslims made their pilgrimage.
Yep.
So, in the view of Sufi, how do you reflect on that tragedy?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Again, I'm just feeling you guys are asking such good questions. And the question is, you know, seeing this really quite horrible tragedy in Mecca just recently, where I think over 700 people died. You know, I mean, there's a few ways to think about that. I mean, part of it is logistics. I mean, simply put, if you have the largest annual pilgrimage in the world, you really have to manage that carefully, logistically. And I don't, you know, they're still trying to figure out what happened. Did some pilgrims do something that they shouldn't have done that then caused a chain reaction? But, you know, there's another side of me that wants to say, well, the people who are running it should try to anticipate these things and do their very best. And again, I can't speak to much of that besides the fact that I think it's partially a logistical question. You know, if people are going to be doing these rituals at one time and place, you really better have some top-notch systems set up to make sure that these kinds of things don't happen. You know, I'm not quite sure what else to say beyond that, but yeah.
So the concept of heaven is there. You practice something and then you end up in heaven.
Sure, yeah.
What brings you there?
Sorry?
What brings you there?
What's in heaven?
A Sunni.
Yeah.
Say, hey, what are you doing here?
Yeah. You know, this is a really interesting question, right? So yeah, the question of heaven and hell. This is a part of Islamic cosmology, for sure. The Quran actually spends a lot of time talking about heaven and hell, and then it uses very, what we might call sensual or even sensational imagery. To read its descriptions of hell are scary for anybody. If you read it, it sounds terrifying. And if you read the descriptions of heaven, you know, rivers of milk and honey and wine and beautiful servants and gardens, and you know, it's this kind of imagery. Now, there's just one thing that comes to mind, and I think coming from a Christian background, people can sometimes think, well, shouldn't heaven be like a spiritual state? And certainly the Sufis would actually say, we actually don't care about heaven. I mentioned Rabia. She said, I'm going to go burn it down. And I'm going to put out hell, because that's a sideshow. God is where it's at. We want God. That's where we're going. Forget the rest. Right? So certainly Sufis have brought that perspective. But just, I don't know, this is just a story that comes to mind. I think this is from the movie, was it from the movie Black Robe? Which is kind of about Catholic missionaries in North America working with Aboriginal peoples. But regardless, there's a priest talking to two First Nations Aboriginals and telling them about heaven. And they said, so why do you want to go to your heaven? What's there? And he said, well, you know, you get to contemplate God for all eternity. And they said, well, is there any tobacco in heaven? And he said, no. He said, are there any women in heaven? And he said, well, no. He said, fine, you go to your heaven, we're going to go somewhere else.
Folks, let's hear it for Rory. What a great talk, and it's just wonderful to hear. You know, George and I were talking the other night. He was in Philly and I was up here, and And one of the quotes, oh, don't go away, Rory, come back up here. Yeah, where do you think you're going? You are going to give us a Sufi song, aren't you?
You don't want to hear it. Not for me.
No, but one of the things that George was talking about Rumi, I looked up Rumi on the internet and talking to George, and one of the most wonderful quotes, well, it hit me personally. What a lovely quote that Rumi had. It says, "What you seek is seeking you." And I thought that was so profound. It was just wonderful. Anyhow, on behalf of us all, thank you so much. We have a little something, Vicky.
Thank you so much, Rory. On behalf of SHEN and everybody here at the conference, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you,